Check this out news. We connect the streets.
With us today on Check This Out News, we have Salim Ismail, best-selling author of Exponential Growth, a must-read book for small and large organizations. Salim consults on innovation and growth. His motto, if you're not disrupting your business or industry, someone else is. I love that title right there. Salim, the world today, first of all, I want to thank you as being a guest on our show.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much. The name of our show, this podcast, is titled Business as Unusual. And this is all due to the COVID-19, the coronavirus that has infected the entire planet. One thing is certain, the world will never be the same. We're now into the changing world order. Don't worry about the new world order. It's all about the changing world order. So I'd like to dive in with you and talk about a couple of different things, get your feedback, one from looking at organizations, looking at the future of work, and probably having your crystal ball and looking at what the future looks like.
That sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we're talking about the future of work, kicking this off, a lot of tech companies, we've seen what has happened where they're having their staff now work remotely from home. We're seeing what Twitter has done, Facebook. What do you think is happening now? Has the tech world, the tech community now set the trend in which other industries will follow and this whole notion of working remotely from home?
I think so. And I think, when you ask people to go back and be stuck in traffic for an hour each way, people are going to go, why am I doing this? It was much easier before when I could work from home. And so we, because it's been so prolonged, I think we've gotten into a new habit of dealing with the kids and dealing with other stuff all at the same time. And I think this becomes the new normal. I think this becomes now working at the office or not becomes kind of optional. And this will have a huge impact as we scale this for real estate, downtown, commercial real estate. What happens to all the lunch support systems across, say, New York City, all the delis, et cetera? The ripple effects are going to be profound.
Wow. Is it safe to say the office space has been put to rest? But
I think it is safe to say that. I don't know how we navigate this. We're going to have to figure out how to do the equivalent of the water cooler kind of discussions offline, which used to happen offline. Now we have to do that online. And people are trying to work that out. And those behaviors are starting to work themselves out now.
Wow. As the anti-big business movement kicks off, is it safe to say that small is the new big?
Small is totally the new big, with the exception that there's a lot of small businesses that'll get deeply impacted and shut down because of this, right? A huge number of mom and pop stores, retail stores, small restaurants, all get wiped out permanently because of this. But in their place, a whole new stream of small businesses pops up. The reason I'm so fascinated and passionate about small business is two things. First, over the last 60 years, 100% of net job growth has come from small businesses. Big companies have been getting bigger, but they've also become more efficient. And it turns out all job growth has been coming from that sector. The second is more interesting in that the advanced technologies for the entire history of our world have always been more expensive as they get more advanced. So in the past, only a big company or a government lab could afford to do R&D, develop products and services based on new technologies because they only had access to them because they were just so expensive. For the first time in history, advanced technologies are actually really cheap. Solar energy is cheap, sensors are cheap, the blockchain is open source and free. And now any individual, any small business can take on some radical new technology and go do things with it that a big company could not even hope to do. And so I think we're going to see an explosion now of new ideas coming out of the woodwork.
That's interesting right there. I look at, we're all kind of getting into this, we're self-isolating, we're getting Zoom fatigued, right? That's been a new thing now. How will this impact business? What becomes the shift where, I look at the travel industry, you and I, we travel, and now that's been radically impacted, right? And so that forces you to do a lot of your business. You're navigating through the screen, and the new bank is now your smartphone. What is this? What is this shift? What is this about?
Well, I think now this completely changes the notion of place. The world was becoming a smaller and smaller place. We were meeting each other in business class lounges and bouncing around to events and conferences all over the world. All of a sudden, that's been completely zapped. And now we stay local, but we connect virtually in a very powerful way. So now the concept of doing business is a virtual connection, but physically separated. And that paradigm is going to continue for a while to go forward. And we don't know when it comes back. I'm thinking this is a minimum 2-3 year transformation period where because this thing is not going away. A second phase is coming. It's morphing. We're at least a year and a half away from vaccine or mass testing. And so that means this is going to stay the same for a long time to come, which means that I love your framing of AC and BC, because this is really an inflection point. We call it a singularity in many cases, because you can't measure past this event horizon. Nobody could have predicted what the world might look like once this happened. And now we have to navigate it. And the leadership in the world is sitting around going, what the hell do we do? And they have very little idea. So it's a huge stress on leadership globally.
I'm going to get back with you on leadership. You mentioned the word singularity, and you also sat on the board for Singularity University. How do you look at what has happened, what's happening now, and its impact on education, right?
Yeah.
The classroom structure. You see what happened today with University of Southern Cal.
Yeah. So this fundamentally transforms higher education. And there's a lot of people who've been commenting on the how broken it is for a while. The kind of elite universities they kind of do okay because their waiting lists were very long anyway. But the second and third tier universities are completely done. There's no reason somebody would go to an AI course when they can get it from the world's best AI lecturer online for free. And so this completely decimates the higher education model, which was already under stress already, but this basically puts it over the edge. And so we think we're going to see a lot of carnage in the second and third tier universities and higher education starting September.
When you talk about the education system already being under stress, elaborate on that, because I'm aware of that, but I'd love to have our listeners
hear
you on that. And to add to that, I'm going to put a twist to this. You have school was once designed where you had to take your pre-electives to get into your degree and, follow that journey. Millennials today, I just want to go straight to what I want to learn. Right? That's right. And now online, YouTube has done has made an impact in itself, right?
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear, talk to me a little bit about prior to where COVID was, the stress that education was already under.
Right. And my experience in this is I'm one of the founders of Singularity University, which is based in Silicon Valley. It's a kind of an incubator thinking place and an academics environment where we look at fast-moving technologies. So we've looked at this in detail for a decade now. And there's a couple of big problems with education. The first is the concept of the classroom has not changed in several hundred years. Tables and chairs, etc. I mean, from the 1800s, we're kind of in the same place. That's kind of tragic in one sense. The second is that we've been doing education for hundreds of years on what you call a push basis. You get a bunch of kids into a classroom, you try and cram algebra into them, right? Mostly they're thinking about lunch. And we test on a standardized basis. And I guarantee you, your learning patterns are very different from mine. Right? And very different from Shanoy's and very different from other people. Each person has a very distinctive learning style, and we only test for one. And so, for example, if you're autistic at all, you don't navigate the current education very well, yet you could be a genius, right? And you look at the most fascinating product developers, breakthrough thinkers, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, etc., all dropped out of university. Because it structures your mind. Peter Diamandis used to make this observation. The more you go into a bachelor's and a master's and a PhD, the more narrow your focus is. If you're doing a PhD in biotech, you're studying the ion channel of a dendrite of a worm for 7 years. You are not getting general wisdom about the world. And I think what's going to change now is that we're going to learn by doing more. So in the future, an engineering degree won't be, what did you study for 4 years? It'll be, go build a bunch of stuff. And after 4 years, what did you build? And if it's good enough, then, okay, here's your degree. And I think it will learn by doing much more aggressively. And the best way of learning about business is actually build a business, right? And so people do much more of that going forward.
Interesting. So what do you see? What would your suggestions be to universities in terms of the future of education? What are some things that they could, what type of insight could you give to say to USC?
Yeah.
UNLV. I went to UNLV. What would be your suggestion in terms of their giving them some outlook for the future, the next 30, 50 years?
There's only one way of navigating this. And the reason there's only one way of navigating this is I've been dealing with and advising a lot of universities over the last decade, right?
Right.
And one of the problems that we have with innovation today in general is what I call the immune system problem. So I was at Yahoo, I was the head of innovation there, running their incubator. And if you do anything disruptive and really innovative, the company hates you and the antibodies inside the company attack you. Because all of our big organizations are geared for predictability and they're geared for efficiency. They're not geared for different things. So this is a huge challenge and it's a structural issue. What we've been working on is how do you solve that immune system problem? And that's part of the work that we do in our ecosystem. We've figured that out in big companies. We've worked that out in public sector, but academia has the worst immune system you've ever seen. They are not open to changing. The tenure system in big universities and so on is not conducive to allowing new ideas in, ironically. And so there's a structural barrier to change. The only way to do it is to kind of create a completely new college or university away from the core organization, away from the thing, and let that keep it safe and protected and ideally stealth, and let that be the place where you do innovation and new models, test new things, and over time that becomes a new gravity center.
Nice, like that. You know, as we're talking about companies kind of, you know, you're working from home, rest in peace, the office space. Well, with that in mind, what will, you know, companies are now issuing out mobile devices, tablets, laptops, what have you. What role will cybersecurity play in the future of work for large and small organizations?
This is a massive, massive issue. And somebody you should talk to is Mark Goodman, who's one of my colleagues. And he wrote a book called Future Crimes, which is a book on the future of cybersecurity and the future of crime. Because criminals are interesting. They're a very innovative group. They're not regulated by ethical or ethical behavior. And so they can innovate freely. And so he's like, what can we learn from there? And let me tell you one of the favorite stories I have from that. There was a bank robbery in the Midwest somewhere. And the bank called after the robbers left and said, we just got robbed. And they were wearing construction gear, vests and helmets and hard hats and all the rest of it. And so the police said, well, that should be pretty easy. Who are the gang of construction workers running away? Well, what these guys had done is put an ad on Craigslist saying super high paying construction jobs at 9 a.m. at this address, be here with all your construction gear. So you go outside and there's 800 construction workers. And so they melted away into the crowd. So they basically crowdsourced their escape.
Oh my gosh.
And so this is like super innovative at one level. Right? How can we learn from that? And so he wrote a whole book that actually became the Amazon Business Book of the Year. This is probably the biggest threat because anything digital can be hacked. And so navigating this pattern is going to be one of the biggest pieces of work we have to do over the next decade or so, is solve that problem.
Crime is innovation.
Crime is innovation.
You heard it here first on Check This Out with Salim. That's a new one. Wow, I really have to.
Only crime is one step behind porn, because porn actually is the real innovation, and then crime.
Porn is the real.
And then yeah, that's right.
Now Shanoy joins in. You talk about porn, I'm in. That's interesting. I like what you've shared thus far. Let me. There's so many questions that I want to get into, but.
Well, let's hold on one second. While we're on the porn topic, note that the entire porn industry got completely disrupted by the DIY uploading of people doing their own porn, right? Pornhub, et cetera, completely wiped out the industry. And so you see how radically things can change. New technologies can change existing industries incredibly fast without a blink of an eye.
Right. Absolutely, this is true. Porn, I'm aware porn has always been at the forefront of innovation. I look at, had it not been for porn online streaming, that would probably be the
E-commerce.
predecessor, exactly, the predecessor to YouTube.
That's right.
Taking a step back, going back onto the, working remotely from home, from your eyes, would you think, how would this affect the racially divide?
I think it's actually good because, there's the old saying that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, right? There's a famous New Yorker cartoon, and it allows us to integrate cleanly with people and with safety at one level, so we can actually connect deeply with people. For the first time ever, you can get to know somebody intimately without ever having physically met them. And so it's kind of, we have the issue of physical safety that brings up when you have racial stereotyping, et cetera, goes away. Right, I might naturally be concerned about meeting Shanoy in a back alley because he's got hair, and so I mistrust people that have hair. And now I have the safety of dealing with it and not having to think about it, and I can interact with him and get to know him well for who he is, rather than just the foliage. And so that interaction with protection in a way will, I think, have a bigger effect on racism than we ever had before.
Interesting. Michael Lynn wrote a book called The New Class War, and in there he talks about this knowledge worker, and the ability to transition from the office and work remotely from home. That's very much streamlined for those who can do that. But if you're not in that bubble or in that lane, and you're in the service industry, and one of the things that we've seen within COVID is this division, right? The essential versus the non-essential workers. And so when I talk about the racial divide, I actually look at it from the optics of how many minorities, or the Latino, the Black community, the Philippine community who work in the service industry, and how they will be impacted, right? Yeah, they don't have the option of working from home.
And this is a huge issue. This will be a huge problem that we have to figure out to solve. And not just the working from home, but if you take, say, suburbs of Houston, the bandwidth they get are terrible. They have basically they have dial-up kind of level bandwidth speeds. They just can't participate in this new economy because, say, some of the segmentation in wireless carriers and broadband penetration in the US has been so skewed and unfair. And so I think there's going to be two levels of this. One is the people that have to physically be there for work, hospital workers, restaurant workers, et cetera. That's going to be a huge challenge. And the second is people that don't have good access to bandwidth through no fault of their own, now are stuck behind an area and they just can't even get there. In Houston, one kid playing Fortnite will take out the internet for everybody, and basically nobody can get their homework done, right? So this sets you back hugely in terms of development if you can't actually interact and use the rich internet environment like any of your peers can.
Well, we've seen, one of the things that probably has been exposed as a result of COVID is the infrastructure as it relates to the internet.
Yeah.
Government websites, right? People are looking for their stimulus checks. They're trying to make calls, trying to access the internet. Right now, I know the state of California, for those who are trying to apply for various government relief programs, they've had numerous breakdowns with the website itself.
That's right.
So we've seen this, and what would your take be, or what would be a message for government, right, that they can do?
Yeah, so like exponential government is like an oxymoron, right? In many countries, you still have to send a fax to get anything done. And so this is a completely new era. The good news is it's going to force the digitization of government faster than anything we've ever seen. Because if you've got to get a fingerprint done or some authentication and validation, and you just physically can't get there, what do you do? And so now they have to find ways of dealing with this in a totally new way. I think what's exciting about this is going to take areas like identity and completely transform it, right? Because identity used to be a very specific way that governments mandated. And now you have to mail in a something with your fingerprints on it. How do you? If I could go a level deeper than that, it's going to force a complete rethink of government, because almost all government, there's one of our speakers, Jerry Mikulski, talks about the idea of trust, Okay. And we frame a lot of our thinking as Mad Max or Star Trek. And in a Mad Max world, you don't have a lot of trust. And in a Star Trek world, you have infinite trust because you've got abundance of food resources, air, water. You don't have to worry about your survival needs. And therefore, it gives you free to be self-expressed and diverse and have lots of creativity, etc. there. He makes the point that almost all of our institutions are based on mistrust. The government is always saying to you, prove that you're 18, prove that you have a driver's license, prove that you have the building permit, etc., etc. Well, now we can actually scale trust in a way that we've never been able to. Uber, eBay, e-commerce platforms have shown that we can scale identity and we can scale trust, in which case you actually don't need a lot of government services, right? Almost all government services, for example, are authenticating you. And now we have the blockchain that can authenticate itself, and you actually don't need it. So I think this is going to be incredibly powerful for rethinking government. But we have two paths then. One is people go, oh my God, that's crazy. Clamp down on it because we don't know where this is going to go. And that's kind of like the Chinese approach. Or you have the total other extreme where people in Texas is, I ain't wearing a mask, it goes against my constitution, right? And you're like, there's a balance here that we can find that allows us to create a really wonderful society based on identity, based on trust, that actually can be scaled if we can navigate that. And what we're trying to do is think about how do we navigate that.
Right. So again, due to the pandemic, we've seen millions of workers, people be able to have the luxury of working from home. But we've also seen this other side, which has been the fact that the country's been exposed. I speak on the government websites, education, and digital IDs.
Yeah,
I'd be curious. I'd love to hear from you. What does America need to do to be better prepared digitally?
I think the first is bandwidth, high bandwidth everywhere. And the beauty of that, the nice part about that is that's coming via satellite, internet satellite, very quickly. We now have kind of mesh satellite formations that can deliver broadband very, very effectively, and that will completely transform the world. 5G is coming, which is going to give us even more bandwidth.
Did 5G have anything to do with coronavirus? That we just need to hear from conspiracy theorists want to know.
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't. There are some areas we have to be concerned about in terms of concentration of frequencies, etc. But they've been doing the testing on that. The big issue is it actually doesn't. It's not. The higher power you get, the more narrow your pointing has to be. So you can't just do like low frequency radio goes everywhere, and it goes far, and so you just don't get high power out of it. And so you have a trade-off in physics on that. And 5G gives you a little bit of both, but it gives very high-powered systems that give you huge amounts of bandwidth for healthcare sensors and security sensing and monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some incredible stuff coming there. But I think once you get broadband internet everywhere, that's a starting point that everybody's on a level playing field. Everybody can be on the information superhighway at that point. I think the biggest question, though, is what happens to money and what happens to the economy? Because a lot of the current economy is based on money velocity, is how quickly do I spend money at a restaurant that they spend on buying supplies, that they spend on buying other equipment, et cetera, and it goes around that way. And the money velocity is a key part of the equation for driving the economy. And the money velocity is basically stopped for this period of time. And that's going to cause a lot of damage. It's like your blood flow suddenly stops. A lot of your extremities basically fall off because there's not blood getting to them. And so we're going to see a lot of pain. There's one wave coming at the end of July because a lot of the first wave of layoffs mean that unemployment benefits run out on July 31st. So once July 31st hits, there'll be like several million people that literally have no money going forward. And that's going to be one wave. The second wave will be in about September, when all the small businesses that have navigated a little bit, figured it out, closed their restaurant for a few months, now they can't reopen. And that'll be another wave of huge chaos. And we think this is going to collapse the global economy.
I got so many questions. Let's call this the crisis.
Yes.
And I'm going to take what you say and say it this way, remix. The first crisis is the fact that we've had in probably a 3-month period of time, millions of people impacted, right, by this virus.
Yeah.
That would be the first crisis. The second crisis would be the fact that government relief checks, delayed mortgages, rent, eviction notice. This becomes the second crisis, and I'll call this the economic crisis. So we have the coronavirus crisis, the economic crisis. The third one, I'm going to call it, I'm Black, the anti-Black discrimination, the social crisis that we've seen happen. I'm still lost at how COVID has impacted the entire world. And then the situation in Atlanta, not Minnesota, the shooting happened. Then came Minnesota. How did we get there? I would have thought, like, once upon a time, and I'm sure you were there, where during COVID, it was about reset, right? Let's take time out, reset. Everybody, hey, I'm going to get into myself. I'm going to, get creative. There were so many different stories, but we never saw this racial thing happen. Now the fourth crisis comes, and I'm going to call this one trust. And you spoke on trust earlier. Trust, which is kind of the cumulative of both the first, right? COVID, once upon a time, certain Blacks in America didn't think that they were affected. Yeah. If you look at the early days, it was just white older people. To then all of a sudden, what is it? Is it affecting the cold weather? Is it the warm weather? What's going on? Well, so many different things. There go the trust factor. Government has played a big role in that. The global institutions, leadership, trusting in each other, trusting in ourselves. I'd love for you to expand on this. This is what I call the crisis. So we have 4 crises here. And the fact that you spoke earlier on the word trust, which is, to me, the new goal moving forward. I'd love for you to expand, painting this picture. What is your take on this?
So if you go back several hundred years, right, we use capitalism and money to lift out of feudal systems and religious power structures, and now we put all of our faith in the capitalist and money, business, commerce. Capitalism is the main mode of discourse in the world today. Okay? And great, it's lifted us out of poverty. Capitalism has allowed us to pump oil out of the ground and kind of create energy everywhere. We've created cars and planes, and we've created the global modern economy based on that. The best analogy on this comes from Lawrence Bloom, and he's like, the capitalist economy is like the rocket booster that gets you out of orbit. It's big, heavy, very noisy, very messy, very ugly. It gets you out of the gravity well of Earth. But you get to a certain point, and then you have to jettison that big, heavy thing, and now you use a much lighter craft going forward. And we have to now design that lighter craft. What does the future look like that's much more elegant, that's much less capitalist, that takes the human being into account much more? What does the human economy look like going forward? Because right now, we serve the economy. And we are now at a point where we need to transition that where the economy serves us going forward.
Very good point.
And we will not be happy and satisfied until our needs as people, our spiritual dimension, gets met by the technology rather than us having to serve it. And we are in that transition point now. It's very delicate because the minute that you have to jettison that thing at the right time. If you wait too long, the whole thing takes you down. If you do too early, you crash back to Earth. Right? And what Corona has done is essentially shown us that this is the time to jettison that old big rocket called capitalism. Now, when you make that transition point, lots of ugly things show up that you never saw before, and that's part of the opening up of the latent racism. I was talking to Margaret Atwood, who did *Handmaid's Tale*, right? Yeah. And I said to her, "Man, you wrote that in the '80s. It's happening now." Like, right. And she goes, "That's been sitting for 300 years waiting to come out. Now it's coming out, and it's like popping a pimple. You just have to get through it. It's ugly. It's messy." And you just have to get through that and get to the next stage. And we are now in that transition point. How we operate in this next 20 years will define the next 500 years of humanity. This is one of those critical inflection points in the world.
Wow. I have several questions already posed in terms of the crisis that I spoke on. When we go back to the second crisis, this economic crisis, you spoke, you gave a quick overview, but I'd love for our listeners to be prepared for the real economic crisis. And just to set you up, we're getting the stimulus checks. You're getting these little things that I really look at like band-aids to a bigger problem, right?
Yeah.
I'd love for you to expand so that our listeners are educated from Salim in terms of what this will mean, one, in the U.S. and how it will affect the world, especially in countries such as India, the continent Africa. What will be the impact there, and how it will affect the poor?
Yeah. So there's very good news. There's very bad news. Okay. The very bad news is that if you look at how we've been running the economy over the last few decades, it's been horrible. What we've been doing, we've actually been creating $4 of debt for every dollar of increase in GDP. Okay, so if you go back 5 years ago, 2015, just 5 years ago, we had 150. We had $50 trillion of global GDP, and we were 150 trillion in debt globally. Okay. Roll forward to 2019, we'd created 85 trillion in GDP, and we were 300 trillion in debt. So we've increased debt 160 trillion to increase 40 trillion of GDP. That is not sustainable. If you go to a bank and say, listen, lend me $100 so I can be $400 more in debt, watch the reaction. Just try that. They'll just laugh you right out of the bank in a second. Right. They will never give you a loan. But because our central banks can keep printing money with no accountability, that's the issue. And essentially, this entire economic recovery since 2008 has essentially been printing money. We've not had underlying productivity increase. So what happens when you print money the way we have, asset prices go up, price of land, real estate, stock prices. That's why the stock market is booming, not because the economy is doing better. We're just printing a lot more money. So suddenly an Apple stock that used to be 100 is now $800. They've not made, the company has not created 10x more value. They've just created so much more printed money. This crisis has had us print about $4 trillion of money in a $10 or $11 trillion GDP. So we've just deflated the economy by $4 trillion. So what's going to happen is, in the short term, that works. In the medium term, you're going to suddenly see everything be 40% more expensive. So the thing that costs $10 will now cost $14. Now, if you own assets, real estate, stocks, etc., you kind of keep pace. If you don't own assets, which is the service economy people, 90% of the population does not own stocks, for example. Right. You're toast. Your net worth has dropped 40%. And this, we're going to see then, over the next 6 months, radical deflation of the dollar and other currencies, because everybody in the world is doing this. Then there'll be a flight to cryptocurrencies and other mechanisms that are safer, gold, cryptocurrencies that don't suffer from that problem. And the world would change fundamentally at that point. But basically, the economics as we knew it is gone. That bubble has now been pricked, and you can't come back from that pricking of that bubble. Once it starts to implode, the whole system implodes very quickly on itself.
One of the things that we're seeing.
So the world is talking about central bank digital currency.
Yeah.
And we're talking of USD, digital US dollars. So how do you think that's going to affect whatever is happening right now? Because now you have immense power to print dollars just out of thin air in the digital world.
Well, let's note that the US dollar has been the digital currency for about a decade and a half already, right? We don't really use money that much, or physical money that much anymore anyway. So it's basically an ephemeral concept at this point. The difference is that it's deflationary and you can print it as much as you want. And therefore, the problem there is you lose now people flock to the dollar because it's a safe currency, quote unquote, right? But that bubble will now be pricked as we move to cryptocurrencies. China is moving very quickly to try and move off the dollar as fast as possible. Russia is trying to do the same. So the minute the dollar stops being the global currency of trade, the whole thing starts collapsing on itself. And all the debt that the US has will cause a huge issue. Now, the small business societies like India, China, emerging markets actually stay safer because they're more resilient. Their economy is much more based on local farmers, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out that 80% of all monetary transactions are local transactions. So people are printing their own money. We've actually helped the city of Medellin create a currency for their local ecosystem. We're doing the same with Chile right now. And there's a project that we're launching in Miami to launch a token just for the Miami area. And so people, what we'll see is the breakup of national currencies down to local city-based currencies, and that'll have an exchange rate based on the economic resiliency of Sao Paulo versus Rio versus Miami versus Houston, et cetera, et cetera. And we think that's where it'll go over time. The massive global connected economy based on the dollar is essentially gone right now. People just don't realize it.
Let me ask you this. So this is real. We have a lot of people who've received their stimulus checks, and lack of education. The first thing that they do is go buy a television.
Yeah,
they go to Walmart to buy a television. I'd love for you. What would be your message? Let's say, particularly to the Latino Black community, who I understand passionately why they would do these things for the immediate gratification that they get. But what would be your message for the Black and the brown in terms of this bubble that we're in? You're getting these checks, you're able to apply for money and what have you, but this is a short window of time. What would be your message in terms of what they should do with their money?
Invested in either land or stocks that have high yield, like dividend-bearing stocks, or Bitcoin. One of those three, because those assets will stay stable and will appreciate. Putting it or keeping it in money in any real form basically has it vanish pretty quickly. And if you can afford it, rather than buying things, buy experiences and enjoy the experience.
Interesting. And you just spoke in terms of, now I'll segue into the future. So I know Miami has been aggressive for some time now, their embracement with blockchain technology.
Yeah.
Now you're talking about a coin. This brings me back to the dollar back when the U.S. currency was first invented, where New York had its own dollar, right? Philadelphia, they had their own dollar. Each state pretty much had their own currency. And it took a long time to get this one bill. Now, which it sounds like what you're saying is that we're actually going to switch and go right back to that. And now that will be governed in the form of digital currency. I'd love for you to elaborate on that. And how long is that 50-year? I have a 7-year-old son. Is that when he's 40? Is that the case?
I have an 8-year-old son, and part of my passion around higher education is I desperately hope the university system implodes before he gets to that age, because I don't want to have to be paying tuition in a system that I think is broken anyway. So that's my
very good point.
That's my personal thing. I'm not talking about decades. I'm talking about months or years. This is not a long-term thing. This happens now. Corona basically accelerates everything that's been happening in the world by about a decade or so. So the advanced digital environment moves forward 10 years, and the older economy goes backwards 10 years. The physical economy goes backwards 10 years. Movie theaters and retail and etc. goes backwards a while, and the digital world goes forward 10 years. So there's a huge schism appearing around that. Retail, Amazon will go forward very quickly. The physical retail stores will go backward very quickly, because if you didn't have your act together, you can't catch up very easily.
Right.
And so you're toast. You don't have the platform play like Amazon does, or Apple does, or Facebook or Google do. And so there's a huge new paradigm coming around that. Regarding the comment about money and the acceleration around that, I think we move to local-based cryptocurrencies within the next 2 to 3 years. I said in 2015 we would see the first digital currency competing against national currencies by about 2020, and it may happen by next year. If Libra takes off, Facebook Libra, that'll accelerate it very quickly also. But I think Bitcoin is a safe place to go, and you then can have a totally different model for the economy. So if the world always ratchets between heavily centralized systems and heavily decentralized systems, and we go back and forth over time. So we centralize, for example, all of our systems into agricultural systems. Then we decentralize those. Then we centralize everything in terms of manufacturing systems, the industrial economy, et cetera. Now we're decentralizing those. So now we're in an age of decentralization. The umbrella pattern that I think we're in is actually what I call a male to female archetype. Okay, so the male archetype, and I mean archetype, not gender, so it's really important here, is top-down pyramid command and control, really good for scarcity, right? So the military-industrial complex, the corporation, Judeo-Christian religions, usually with a man at the top controlling things. The female type pattern is much better for abundance and a decentralized environment. The internet, the rise of Burning Man, the maker movement, the DIY movement, the open source movement, we manage information on the internet by cross-linking, intersecting. It's a nurturing, participatory environment. Okay? Mm-hmm. And we're moving right now from a male paradigm to a female archetype in terms of how we run the world. And the stress you have is the male paradigm is not happy about losing that control.
Right.
So they're throwing a tantrum, and like Wall Street said, we will blow the world economy unless you save us. And so Obama had to step in and help out the banks and save them, because otherwise they would destroy the global economy. And he did, and now we have to move to a new system. And the powers that be don't like it, but it's inevitable just because of the cost of access of new technology is so cheap. Anybody can access to it. So this changes the total paradigm. Let me give you a quick example of that.
Please.
There was a fishing village in Vietnam that once a month a big ship with diesel fuel would come to deliver diesel fuel for their fishing boats. Okay. And at some point, the ship stopped coming because it didn't make economic sense. Now this entire village has no diesel fuel for their fishing boats. They literally looked up at the internet, ordered a solar panel, put it on top of the boat, the canopy of the boat, hooked it up to the propeller, followed instructions, and invented a solar-powered boat. Okay? So here you have cutting-edge innovation using disruptive technologies happening at the frickin' edge of civilization. And we get super excited when we see that, because they will never need a centralized system again. So as we go into this future, we'll have decentralized microgrids for electricity, clean water harvesting systems that are local, vertical farms for growing food at a local level, a local currency in a digital environment. Why do you need a centralized system for anything? And by the way, that system is way more resilient from a cyber perspective because it's decentralized. Mm-hmm. Right now, we spend a lot of time protecting our power plants and our heavy centralized structures because a terrorist could wipe out the entire power grid, for example, with one attack. Right? But if you have a decentralized microgrid structure for energy, what are you going to attack? And so this becomes incredibly more resilient, and that's where we're moving to, a decentralized architecture for managing not just the economy, but our governance, our local systems, et cetera. The fight you're seeing, Trump, Brexit, et cetera, were not left versus right. It was urban versus rural. Okay, and so we're going to see the rise of city-states that define the future. And if you think about the biggest cities in the world, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Shanghai, Tokyo, those are bigger and more complex than almost any country was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And in a city, you don't need a passport in a city. Everybody knows where they fit. It's small enough they kind of wouldn't know how to navigate it, big enough that you have critical mass of lots of things. And once you have food resiliency, energy resiliency, water resiliency, you don't need the country.
Right.
The problem is the countries have the armies and they will not go quietly into the night.
Let's take a step back. June 30th, the Senate Banking Committee held a hearing on the future of digital currency. I'd love to see, obviously, and to your point, China, they're going aggressive with their own digital currency. And now we see that the US is actually taking a page from Libra. I'd love for you to be able to expand, because obviously that started. But again, I'm tuned in with you to say, for especially for the brown community, the minorities, whether you're Philippine, Latino, Black, this is important for them to hear from you in terms of the future of money, because it's something that, especially for young folks, we make it rain. Make it rain is a popular thing in hip hop. So they want those dollars. Show me those dollars. I'd love for you to be able to expand what digital currency will do, as well as what is the value, what is is the dollar currently dying? Is it rest in peace for the dollar, just as it is for the office space?
The dollar will have an issue over the next few years. It will not be the same thing in 5 or 10 years that it is today. Today, it's the dominant currency in the world. It's used for trading of everything because people have faith in the U.S. government. Okay, right. The only ability, by the way, that you have faith in the government,
or faith in the government is dying.
That's dying. That's the key point. And the point is, the key is, can you tax your population in the future? That's basically what you're betting on when you bet on the US dollar or a fiat currency of any kind. Can you tax your people in the future? And that's why they issue bonds, T-bills, etc. You're betting on that. Now, as we deflate the economy via technology or via things like Corona, that becomes a huge question. Can you tax your people? Because you can't just go printing money without radical inflation creeping in at some point. So at some point, this comes home to roost and the whole thing implodes. You don't want to be there holding a lot of dollars when that happens. You want to be in assets, and you want to be in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin that don't inflate. Right? And so you need a safe space. And there's three reasons for having money. Either as a store of value, or as a unit of account, or as a means of exchange. Now, if as I said earlier, 80% of transactions are local. If I had a currency for the Puerto Rican economy, where almost all of the transactions are happening just within Puerto Rico, I don't need a separate dollar. I can run off my own currency and only go intersect when I need to go offshore or bring in imports. And because it's digital, it's free and it scales.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like we have our own currency for our ecosystem because I have almost 6,000 consultants around the world, and you can't pay 6,000 people in 100 countries. There's just no way of doing it. So we needed a token structure to do that. So we created our own. Well, once we start trading amongst ourselves, we don't need the outside world. So we have a money velocity of our own in our own ecosystem where one consultant hires another, and the money's rotating in our ecosystem. That's what we expect to see happen in cities and towns. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, by that example there, you're basically paying them in the token, and then they go ahead and maybe either keep the token or exchange it for the dollar of their country.
That's right. And as long as everybody trusts the same system, back to that word trust, right? Yep. The US dollar is only a piece of paper because we all agree that it's a dollar. And so the minute you have trust in some system, whether it's Bitcoin or others, you can basically change your trust. And digital currencies scale and they're cheap. We run our entire economy on like 10 or 15 grand a month. Like that's nothing. You don't need a central bank. It's the whole thing manages itself. And so the whole thing becomes a totally new paradigm on which to operate. And digital scales and digital scales trust. And therefore, when you can scale trust, you don't need money in the same way. You can operate on totally different paradigms. So this is a classic thing like education, monetary systems. All of our old top-down structures are going to dissolve to these different peer-to-peer nurturing participatory environments. And we have to just move as quickly as possible to that new paradigm.
Gotcha. Well, I'm listening to you on that. Sure, go ahead.
There's a concern that when the digital dollar arrives, there's going to be more centralization, like a dystopian environment where if I attend a Black Lives Matter protest, the government is going to ban my wallet and I have no access to food.
Yes.
So similar things will happen in every country.
Yes.
What do you think about that? And how does Bitcoin fit in here?
Well, Bitcoin is pseudonymous, right? So it's not anonymous, but it's pseudonymous, meaning if I buy something in Bitcoin, it takes a while before people can figure out whether it was me or not. So that gives you some safety. A digital dollar is not great. It's just like Libra or the Chinese currency that they're trying to do. They have identity tagged into the currency. So they can track a dollar from where it went. Like the people complain about drug dealers using the cryptocurrencies. Drug dealers don't use cryptocurrencies. The $100 bill is the weapon of choice for a drug dealer because that's truly anonymous. But a digital dollar, I know exactly what the path it went through, who had it before you, etc., and you can track it implicitly. I think it really comes down to over time of figuring out, deciding who is the government. Okay, now in the U.S., the government is ideally for the people, by the people, of the people. So the government is you. In authoritarian regimes, the government is some elite class ruling over you. And that's why people get upset about some certain countries like China, if they have a digital currency and a social credit scoring mechanism, etc. The problem in the US, we're heading towards that authoritarian way, and we need to stop it. And that's, I think, the power of Corona and the power of what's happening now, Black Lives Matter, etc., it's going to stop the progression to that new paradigm.
Right. In India, they scanned the iris of over 1 billion people.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a huge challenge if that becomes... Now, if it stays a democracy, great.
Yeah.
What role does Donald Trump have in this?
He's accelerated... he's again accelerating everything. You know, there was a 3-page article that was circulated in the last election. Okay. And the title of the paper was How Democracies Die. And it went through a series of arguments saying, okay, what happens in a democracy is as the democracy matures, people get comfortable in the democracy, they take it for granted, they then elect, they start complaining about stupid little things. They then elect a leader who's from the elites but pretends he's for the people. He then gets elected as a populist who then proceeds to dismantle all the institutions of democracy, and then the democracy collapses. Okay? And that paper, then you get to the bottom, it was written by Plato in the year 2000 BC. And you're like, holy crap, like we know this from 3,000 years, that this is how democracies die. And we're watching this train wreck, and it's just happening. And this is the enormous challenge when I saw an article in the New York Times today about Texans arguing about wearing the mask. Right, saying it's against my constitutional right. Well, I mean, come on. This is the enormous challenge now of how you think about this. It's like the vaccination challenge. It's like any kind of socialized environment. I'll throw you a crazy term that I've been bouncing around, which is technological socialism. Okay, so socialism fails for 2 reasons. One is that governments allocating resources get corrupt very quickly. And second is that they are too inefficient. If they suddenly need to change the way they're doing things, governments don't change very quickly, and the whole thing fails. One of those 2 reasons is why socialism fails. But you think about Uber. Uber is a socialist application. It's a sharing of assets amongst a large group of people. But when an algorithm allocates which driver should match which passenger, then you have a very effective socialism structure. You share assets incredibly effectively. And so we're going to see more and more of this, where the digital environment allows us to share assets in a meaningfully interesting way. And we don't have to have a centralized structure dealing with it. We can have a decentralized algorithm dealing with it. Now the question is how does the algorithm work, and is it efficient? So we're getting to an age where the power of the algorithm drives the future.
Nice. How different do you expect the workplace in developing countries to look?
I think
we put emphasis on, and I'm sorry, just to set you up, we put a lot of emphasis on China, right? The passing of the guard, right? The Roman Empire. Now it went from the UK, the British Empire to America, and it looked like it's going to go to China in the next 10 years, 20 years, something like that.
Yeah.
But for developing nations, I've heard stuff in terms of the continent Africa. It seems like things are in place for Europe, America, and China, but what about the rest of the world? And so I'd love to hear your insight.
So I'm negative and pessimistic about the future of the U.S., Europe, and China, by the way. I'm optimistic about Africa massively, and I'm nervous about India. Okay, so let's break that down. Europe, US, China are old top-down structures, big structures, and we've seen that big companies and big governments don't work well in this future coming past. All the countries that dealt with Corona badly are big countries: China, Russia, India, Brazil, etc. All the countries that dealt very well with it were small countries: Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, etc. You can manage things when you're a small country. Too hard to manage, say, the US today. You take a Hells Angel biker in San Francisco and the Hells Angel biker in Alabama. Same bike, same clothes, very, very different people.
Right.
And trying to govern them with the same laws doesn't work in the future. Right. So we think the big countries have a dim future in this. We think we'll see small city states, as I said, ruling that. So that takes out the US, that takes out Europe, that takes out China in some extent. Okay. Then you get to the emerging markets. India's a mess because it's a centralized environment with democracy across the whole country, but they speak 20 different major languages, and Modi has allowed nationalism to creep in. And that means you've got an 80% mob rule, which is a really bad situation. And he's trying to create a religious state. And no religious state has ever succeeded. So India's going to be a mess for a while they either undo that or let that carpet roll out. Africa, I think, has some incredible possibilities because, say just in management thinking, right? Mm-hmm. We have to unlearn 50 years of MBA thinking in Europe or in the US, etc. And Africa can basically leapfrog that whole paradigm. There were maybe 25 million landlines in Africa, and they leapfrogged the entire landline paradigm to a billion cell phones. And we think the same thing will happen with governance structures, new models, etc., because they can just jump to the new very, very quickly. And when you have abundant energy, clean water, healthcare, education, you can get to that point much more quickly than in the past. So I'm hugely optimistic about Africa starting in about a 10-year period.
10-year period. And what hope do you see for the South America?
South America also huge. I'm hugely optimistic. I've spent over the last decade a lot of time in South America, Brazil, Mexico, Ecuador, Costa Rica, places like that. And I'm very optimistic. They have to solve the corruption problem. But if you have blockchain type technologies, you can actually solve corruption. Right. And we've seen places solve corruption. Indonesia actually solved corruption pretty effectively using a combination of public shaming, accountability, transparency, etc. And we can copy those and apply them now in places like Mexico. We actually did a project with the with the Supreme Court in Colombia and the president's office to transform the justice system in Colombia. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to do the right things. They know they need to transform. And if you can unleash that, there's incredible entrepreneurialism latent there waiting to come out. And so I'm pretty optimistic about Latin America.
I want to shift a little here and talk about China and then get into some other questions wrapping up. China's social reward program. What is your thought about that on a global scale?
So the fundamental choice comes to whether you have your points and reward systems based on a privatized app like Uber or eBay, where you collect points, et cetera, or in a government structure. Okay. For example, in the US versus Europe, just for a second, the US likes business and hates government. And Europe doesn't like business and likes government. And you have a complete different perspective. In China, they have centralized both. You don't really have much of a choice around it. And so this credit system, scoring system in China will be great for encouraging and navigating behavior in the right way. But I believe it will stifle innovation because innovation comes when you break the rules. And when you're not allowed to break the rules, you won't have innovation.
Interesting.
So I spent 3 months traveling around China and Tibet. And my conclusion at the end of it was that the Chinese are so natively capitalist that they need socialism to put a lid on it. Otherwise, they would sell their grandmother for a profit. I think they're the most natively capitalist people in the world. And you can see that when you do business. They're absolutely fantastic when you do business with them, right? And so you have to be really careful about how you manage that and keep a lid on it in a decent way. Because if you break the rules around that, then you end up in a hell of a mess. And that's so I don't know where this goes, but what we've seen in the past is centralized structures don't work that well for innovation.
Got you. You inspired me with this, the notion of impacting 1 billion people in 10 years. That was radical to me. And I think I caught that in one of your speeches where you talked about that. I look at that and then I look at what Bill Gates is doing with this digital ID. What is your thought? Is that not radical itself? Where if I talk about social rewards, China, and trying to make that a global play, what Bill Gates is doing in terms of digital ID, one ID for every person on Earth. What is your thoughts on that? And do you see that the progression of that being a reality in the next couple of years?
I do see it may take like 5 years, but I do believe it'll become a reality. And what's really powerful about that idea is that it's a sovereign ID. It's a self-sovereign ID. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, my identity is given to me by the state. My passport, my driver's license, the state gives me an identity. Okay.
Right.
In a self-sovereign system, I own my own identity. It's given by the blockchain. It's there because I actually exist. And so now there's no state that can tell me that I exist or don't exist. And that gives me supreme power in that. And if that's where I think we will get to, because it's better and it'll allow me to own. Now, if I own my own ID, I can own my own data. Right now, Amazon owns all my transaction history with Amazon. Facebook owns all my social data. But there's lots of movements now to say, hey, wait a minute, I made those transactions. I should at least have a copy of it and we co-own it.
Absolutely.
Or I will rent you my transaction ID for a fee, but I own it, not you. And so there's a whole model of what's called Identity 2.0. Right now we have an eBay ID, we have a Google ID, we have a Facebook ID, and the identity is in that system, or a sovereign ID where the state gives you the identity. But when I can have my own ID, and I give an instantiation to you and somebody else, that's the new model for identity, and the blockchain enables that. The whole power of the blockchain is that it's stateless and trustless.
Right.
And that's incredibly powerful. So we think that paradigm over time will become the new reality. It's just that it will be resisted along the way, just like bankers hate Bitcoin.
We spent a lot of time in terms of blockchain, digital currency. This is a hot topic, artificial intelligence. And I'm curious, is it a danger to mankind, or do you think that it can actually make the world a better place?
I think it makes the world a better place. I don't see it as a danger to mankind. The reason I don't see it is the concern is that we accidentally invent a super intelligence that then goes, humanity's useless, and wipes us out. Okay? And you see that in the Hollywood movies. It's always dystopian. The robot overlords come in. We're in the Matrix. We're in Skynet. If we're lucky, we're pets. If we're unlucky, we're food. It's kind of like the way it goes, isn't it?
Right.
But if you look at how we actually implement technology, we actually use technology to augment the human experience, not to take away from it. I will argue that if I walk out of my house without this, I'm less human. My memory's in there. I can't video with my son. I can propagate empathy around the world by watching what's happening in Minneapolis and propagate empathy, which I can't do if I don't have this device. So the boundary of who I am now extends outside this device, right? And people complain about what's called transhumanism.
Yes.
Where I'm using technology to transcend what it means human. Well, we think that's a bogus argument, because the minute you have a vaccination as a child, you're technically a cyborg. If you're wearing spectacles, you've enhanced your vision with technology, you're technically a transhumanist. It doesn't make you less human. I would argue that it makes you more human, because the more technology we use, the more healthier we are, the more we can self-actualize.
Interesting.
Technology allows us to live better lives, and I can spend more time in deep contemplation and creativity, in humor, in self-expression, in spirituality, which makes me more human. So I totally don't believe the technology takes away humanity thing. Now, does AI take over the world? I believe no. And the reason I believe no is we ascribe what's called anthropomorphism to an object. We think that when a robot becomes conscious, it'll act like a person, because it's the only paradigm we know. Okay.
Right.
Now, we have evolved for 4 billion years to do two things: survive, procreate. That's it. And basically, we're apes with tools, right? That's essentially who we are. But an AI doesn't suffer from that. It doesn't suffer from those constraints. Google's web crawler, PageRank, is a very sophisticated AI system that crawls billions of web pages per second. Now, it's evolving a completely different intelligence that's complementary to ours, not replicative of ours. And so, but we get scared of it because of our amygdala. We think it's going to take over the world, et cetera, et cetera. We have infinite knowledge of how, say, a mosquito works, down to the last nth level of detail. We are very far from creating something even as basic as a mosquito.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that it doesn't happen. It's possible that we evolve and accidentally create an what's called artificial general intelligence, right?
Mhm.
But the idea that we're then set about deliberately or accidentally to wipe out humanity is where I think it goes wrong. It's more likely that stupid humans using AI will wipe us out rather than AI wiping us out.
AI has the ability, would you say, to lies?
So when you think about AIs getting, the concern is that it makes an accidental decision or says, hey, we need to optimize for a better carbon thing, better take out human beings because they cause a lot of carbon problems. That's the concern that we get into. And it's actually a very real concern. But because we're programming those systems, we can take that into account beforehand. So that's the thing. Now, the last point I'll make about AI is that we have had access to the top AI gurus in the world for 10 years. If you take the top AI researchers in the world and you ask them, okay, how many of you are working on creating artificial general intelligence or general superintelligence? The answer is 0. If you say, how many of you are working on the steps that might lead to a super AI? The answer is pretty much 0. Then you ask them, how many of you know what the steps might be that if you worked on it would lead to a superintelligence? They don't know. So we're not working on it. We don't know how the steps are. We don't know how it works. And it's a very difficult problem because you get into a language problem of trying to figure out what do you mean by this. Like we talk about consciousness, right? We don't know what consciousness is. We don't have a definition or a test for consciousness. I feel I'm self-aware. Like that's a subset of consciousness, is being self-aware. I feel I'm self-aware, but my wife disagrees. Right, so where to even start the discussion? So we end up with what's called the language problem. Ray Kurzweil put it very well. He said, language is a very thin pipe to discuss concepts as rich as this. And so we get stuck in the problem, in the communication problem, rather than the real issue. So I'm not worried about AI in that sense. I think the best encapsulation of AI is the movie Her. You know, it's Johansson, where an AI kind of dates a human being and finally evolves to a sense, and it just finds a human being boring, and just goes, the hell with you, I'm going to go interact with those other million AIs out there. It's too boring dealing with you. And they'll just look at us and go, and move on. That's what I think happens.
Interesting. I want to wrap up with a couple more questions. I had a technical difficulty, but I have a lot of text that just came through with people bombarding me in terms of wanting to know, number one, as you spoke on digital currency and what have you, what do you think the role of outfits such as Wells Fargo, Bank of America, what will be their future in the next 10 years? How will blockchain, digital currency impact them? What type of shift will they need to do to stay relevant?
Got it. So I'm not sure how they stay relevant, okay? Because banking unfortunately, banking has become an extractionary industry.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you my crazy stat about banking and financial services in general. In the last few years, 40% of American corporate profits go to financial services. 40% of American corporate profits go to financial services. So they're exacting a huge tax on the rest of the corporate world, saying we'll help you with your finances, but we're taking a huge chunk of it. That's not sustainable. Okay, that's one. If you think about a retail bank is basically a big general ledger saying you deposited $1,000, I lent it out over there, and we track that in detail, and we trust our life savings to that transaction security. Okay, if I have a blockchain-based bank, I don't need the retail bank because it's all there in the blockchain. So there will be a super low-cost blockchain bank that will appear and will make retail banking irrelevant. And that's within a year or two. Not that retail banking becomes irrelevant, but something will appear that over time will make retail banking. I give retail banking 7 to 10 years max. Now, you still need investment banking, you still need other parts of banking, but retail banking is essentially toast, especially when you don't need the digital authentication of the transaction, and especially when you can do multiple cryptocurrencies and you put your trust where. I think the key question is, where do I put my trust?
Back to the word trust. Shinoy, you want to say something?
Yeah, I find the concept of taxing really funny because the currency is being created out of thin air, and it's being issued to people in exchange for their hard work. And then we are taking it back. The government is taking it back.
Yes.
So how is that sustainable?
It's not, actually. The problem is we've ended up in the system. In the 70s, we floated off the gold standard. And the dollar used to peg to be gold. And then we created a debt system because we found we could grow the economy by allowing people to have more debt. And that system has gone crazy now. And now we have unbelievable amounts of debt. Now we're creating more debt to service the previous debt, to service the previous debt, to then create $1 in increased GDP. And that structure is not sustainable. The problem is because it's a structural problem, you can't fix it with an election. And this is maybe the biggest problem that we have with democracy is it's geared towards high metabolism, short-term election cycles. Nobody's looking 20 years out to see what do we need in healthcare, education, legal systems, et cetera, et cetera. And we're actually doing that work now to think about what should our institutions look like in a 20-year period so that we can aim for something better. And I think Corona is a huge opportunity. The global supertanker has been ground to a halt because of this virus, right? This is the first alien attack on the whole of humanity, by the way. It's trying to kill every human being.
Right.
Okay. And note our reaction. Our reaction is instead of banding together as a race and saying, let's defeat this alien, we're like, you wear masks and I'll do this. And it came from over there. And we're totally, so if an alien actually was watching going, oh, wow, man, these guys are going to be super easy to take over when I land. I mean, Donald Trump will try and kowtow to them and et cetera, et cetera. And it's going to be, it's game over pretty quickly if this was a real alien attack. But what Corona has done is taken that global supertanker and ground it to a halt. If we as we restart those engines, our current global leaders will try and set it back in exactly the same direction as it was going, which is really bad for racial tension, income inequality, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. While the damn supertanker stopped, what I want to do is grab the wheel and turn it so that it starts off in a better direction. And that's, I think, the work we have to do as leaders today is figure that out. And that's the work we have to do.
Salim, my phone has blown up with questions, and unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I'm having to really pick the best of the best, and they're all really good questions. But here's a funny one that I thought we'd like to throw at you. Can democracy be put on the blockchain? Is there an algorithm, or is there an algorithm to democracy? That question of about 20 stood out. Like, let me hit him with this. Let's see his response.
Yeah, actually, democracy can be put on a blockchain. And in fact, the new governance models are that. There's a guy called Ralph Merkle, who's famous for creating Merkle hash trees, which is the basis of Bitcoin. He wrote a paper called Democracy, DAOs, and Governance. DAOs being decentralized autonomous organizations that are run on a blockchain. So blockchain-based democracies are the future. And in fact, we're working towards building those today because you can actually, as a small environment, vote anonymously, et cetera, and create a completely new democracy based on that. And you have total equitability in terms of the ideal future is what's called a participatory liquid democracy. And right now we have a participatory representational geographic democracy. We have representatives based on where I live, my region, my state, my county, my district, my congressional district. And we vote on our state by Senate, and we vote on by Congress by a district. But we're getting rid of the concept of place on the internet. So we're moving to what's called a liquid democracy or an idea-based democracy. Larry Lessig, the professor at Stanford, is the most smartest guy on digital rights that I know. I'd like to give him my vote. He's my representative on anything digital, right? And so we'll give people in their practice, they're testing this in Germany, where you give your vote to somebody because of their ideology and because of their ideas, not because of the region they represent. It's because of the ideas they represent.
Right.
That's essentially where we'll move to. But the problem is trying to undo the old is really slow. So when
you say that right there, people voted for Trump because of the ideas that he represented. So what's new?
The problem is that democracy has one other problem, aside from a few others, which is that you rely on an educated population. When the U.S. democracy was first formed, the Boston Harbor, et cetera, the 13 original New England states, It was actually the highest percentage of adult literacy in the history of humanity. 95% of people, of voters, were digitally literate, fully literate, and that's gone down since then. We've never had that again. So democracy relies on an educated population. So here's a crazy statistic for you. When Lincoln was doing his presidential debate with his challenger, and I can't remember who the challenger was, it was a 9-hour debate.
Wow.
So you'd go as a family to a big fairground. Lincoln would speak for 3 hours and get an hour and a half rebuttal from his opponent. The opponent would speak for 3 hours and an hour and a half rebuttal from Lincoln. You sat there, ate food with your kids. You watched the whole thing. At the end of it, you kind of knew who you wanted to vote for. Now you take that 9-hour debate and move it to 10-second sound bites, and that's what we're trying to figure out who should win. The other problem is because of structures like Fox News, we've systematically de-educated 40% of the population. And therefore they can't make a decent decision because they're not living in reality of any kind. Can I tell you a crazy story? Quickly?
Please.
Okay.
Please.
So just after Trump got elected, I was in an Uber in Phoenix, and driver was this heavy-set, fairly unhealthy-looking guy. And I said, "Do you drive full-time, part-time?" Just trying to be polite conversation. He goes, "Way full-time. I drive 18 hours a day." I'm like, "Whoa, that's like really bad. If you're, are you at the beginning or end of your shift?" Hopefully you're at the beginning. And then he tells me this crazy story. He was the CEO of a 300-person construction firm. They voted as a collective to get rid of healthcare, keep corporate healthcare, get rid of it. He lobbied as CEO to get rid of it because it's easier not to have the admin. Slightly more expensive for the people, but they'd have more choice. So they voted, and they voted to get rid of it. So they got rid of corporate healthcare. Then he goes to the doctor and finds, a few weeks later, because he's not feeling well, finds out he's got 4 cancers, all stage 3 cancers riddled throughout his body. And because he's got rid of insurance, he's not protected by pre-existing conditions now. If one of those pops to stage 4, he's a dead man.
Right.
He literally starts planning his funeral, divvying up his estate, saying goodbye to people, starts literally planning for the end times because he's going to die. I'm like, that's unbelievable. It's crazy. What an up and down. Like, what happened? He goes, well, then Obamacare passed, saved my life, because then I could get coverage, got the treatments, and here I am. I'm like, that's what, talk about a roller coaster. One thing you're fine, then you literally think you're going to die. And then this thing. We get to the hotel, and I'm getting out of the car and kind of half joking. I said, in this last election, I guess you must have voted for Hillary Clinton. And he goes, no, I voted for Trump. And I cannot square that circle. How you just said this saved your life. You just said,
right.
And then you voted for the thing, for the person who said he was going to get rid of you. And he goes, yeah, now he's getting rid of healthcare, and I'm probably going to die again.
Oh my goodness.
Well, Mike, I'm Canadian, and I came to Canada a couple of years ago. My Canadian passport is like Golem with my precious. I'm stroking it every day, going, "Thank God I'm Canadian."
Right.
This is a really tough time. On the good news is that we're kind of unearthing and expelling a lot of old toxicity that had to be unrolled. Racism and all the issues that have been bubbling in the U.S. are coming forward now. And what's incredibly inspiring to me is that the number of the entire U.S. population is out on the streets. It's not like 1968 when it was the African Americans out on the streets. Now the entire population is out on the streets saying, no, this is enough, which is fabulous to see.
Wow. This has been a real treat. We got to have you back on the show again. But what I want to do is segue. You yourself are going to you're rolling out your own podcast, Exo World. For our listeners who have really enjoyed this, I'm going to definitely recommend and point them to Exo World podcast. But what can we expect with your podcast and some of the topics that you cover?
So I've had the luxury over 10 years of hearing at Singularity University the top technologists in the world in AI, biotech, robotics, blockchain, etc. Right? As my wife says, I can pretend to speak about anything as a result. And you've heard some of that tonight.
Right.
We are, I think, at this huge inflection point of trying to figure out, do we go down a Mad Max future or a Star Trek future? And both are equally available to us. And how do we move from what the current Mad Max path to more of the Star Trek path. And we want to have those conversations about that transformation in blockchain, in the use of AI, in the ethical use of technology, et cetera, et cetera. And how do we do governance based on that? Who are the people that are leading the charge? What breakthroughs can we expect to see? I'll give you one simple idea. There's now an 8-inch pad, it's about this big, that a woman would put left and right side to detect breast cancer. So a woman takes this pad that's this size, puts it on left and right side, wear it for 10 minutes, you take a photograph. It does a very detailed temperature sensing of that part of the body. And it checks the temperature between left and right. And if you do it every 6 months, checks the delta from 6 months ago. This system turns out to be 80% better at detecting breast cancer than a mammogram. Is like costs about $30, $40. And it's FDA approved. It's FDA approved, fully tested. We can eradicate breast cancer now by just giving every woman in the world this pad, right? And so that's the magic that's coming because of technology. We're about to nail cancer. Raymond McCauley calls this coronavirus the first battle in the last war against disease. He thinks we'll be able to eradicate disease going forward because of the biotech breakthroughs coming through. So we'll talk about all of those ideas, the technologies, and how do we shift to those new technologies and get to a world of abundance and get to that Star Trek world, because we don't want to be doing this. And the reason we created the podcast is exactly to have that conversation about how do we transform the world for a better future.
I look forward to listening. This is exciting times. Salim Ismail, I want to thank you very much for coming on our show, blessing us with your insight. We look forward to having, I know your podcast is going to be distributed on iHeart, Pandora, Spotify, all the top brands. We look forward to listening, embracing you. And most of all, I got to have you back on this show.
Happy to be here. It's been great. And, the questions are always the thing that drive the magic. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is Mike Johns, Tech This Out News. We're signing out. We had the big homie, Salim Ismail.
Tech This Out News. We connect the streets.